Myles Garrett, with 33 tackles for loss, was good enough for second all-time in NFL histories for tackles for loss in a season. And Max Crosby, with 28, was good enough to tie for fifth all-time in NFL history. Welcome to Just the Stats, NFL Top 10's for Thursday. My name's Ernie Jennings, and glad you're here. We're looking for a good show. We're going to talk about the season stats. After this season, who are the top leaders, and did any of them make it into the NFL all-time? We're going to look at that. Only a couple more days until NFL football. Got some games on Saturday, so that's only a couple days away. Looking forward to that. I'll be doing all kinds of stats on the playoffs, game stats, seasons, or career stats as far as the certain players go, who's, had the most rushing yards, passing yards, etc. If there's anybody playing in the playoffs that match any of that, plus game stats. If anybody puts up some big numbers that make it into the top 10 best playoff games numbers, we'll be looking at all that next week. And as a reminder, I will be cutting back to 3 times a week during the off season. I find that seems to be typical with a lot of the NFL podcasts. Some of them just go to once a week, but I'll do 3 times a week. We've got all kinds of stats to look at throughout the season. If you have any particular top 10 items you'd like me to look at, let me know. I've already got one request about NFL kickers, field goals, because I had mentioned about how many field goals there were this year. There were 11 that were 60 yards or more, which is the most ever in NFL history. How does that stack up against the rest of the seasons in the past NFL? So we'll look at that maybe as one of the topics, but we got a myriad of topics to look at. Look at some of the teams, see how they did as teams last year. And we have all offseason to do that. Plus, of course, we have the NFL draft. We have free agency. We'll look at the top 10 free agents, top 10 players in the draft, top 10 teams. Who's the top 10 teams as far as drafting goes and who they might pick. With the NFL, there's just so many things you can talk about. So we'll do all that. But for today, we're going to look at the season numbers. And we'll go from quarterbacks on down. So let's get started with NFL top 10s for Thursday, season leaders. And we'll start with passing yards. Well, that's Matthew Stafford. Actually by a fair amount, because Dak Prescott only played the first half and only had 70 yards anyway. And in fact, he dropped from first to third. Matthew Stafford was first with 4,707 yards this season, which was the highest by quite a bit over. Jared Goff for the Lions was second with 4,564. So what's that, about 143 yards more than the second place team. And then because Dak Prescott only played the half and only had 70 yards, he ended up in third, 12 yards behind Jared Goff. Jared Goff had like 331 yards, something like that. So he put on a big push at the end. Matthew Stafford had a big game, somewhere in the 250-something yards, but he also had 4 touchdowns. And then Drake May was fourth with 4,394. So that's a good 313 yards behind Matthew Stafford. That's a game right there. I was listening to a podcast, and they think Drake May should be the MVP of the season. I don't think so. Yes, they have a better record, and yes, some of his stats are better than Matthew Stafford's in certain categories, but the teams that they played versus the team that Matthew Stafford and the Rams played are quite different. Drake May and the Patriots had a pretty easy going. The toughest team they had all year was Buffalo. They beat them once, lost to them once. But for the most part, when you look at the schedule the Rams had and the teams they had to play, It's just a more difficult schedule. And obviously, you're not going to have the same type of numbers necessarily, even though he did put up great numbers. But we'll see what happens with that. And I could be biased, of course, as well. I mean, I just think he had a tremendous season, and Drake May did. I mean, if Drake May wins it, he probably deserved it as well. Those two players right now are definitely the candidates. All right, that's a passing yards. I won't go through all 10. If you want to see all 10 players that made it into the passing leaders for this past season, yeah, you can watch this on Just the Stats NFL on YouTube, and you can see the charts. I'll put all these charts up there. Now, passing touchdowns. This is where Matthew Stafford just crushed everybody. 46 passing touchdowns for Matthew Stafford. Jared Goff was second with 34. It's pretty interesting to me that in passing yards and touchdowns, it's Stafford and Goff. These are the two quarterbacks who a few years ago switched teams. Stafford coming from the Lions to the Rams and Goff going from the Rams to the Lions. And here they are both still playing quite well. It's a fairly even trade, except for the fact that Matthew Stafford has won a Super Bowl and Jared Goff has not been able to lead his team to that. And this year, boy, the Lions just did not live up to potential. I'll put it that way. They have a really good team of players, did not live up to their potentials. You'll see this when we go through these numbers. You'll see Lions players all through it. Drake May was third in passing touchdowns with 31. So that's a good 15 touchdowns behind Matthew Stafford. Another, tip toward Matthew Stafford. Now, obviously, in passing, there's all kinds of numbers. Drake May is going to crush him in rushing yards and in some other completion percentage. I don't think he crushes him, but he might be better in that, something like that. But so for Stafford, the fact that he had 46 passing touchdowns was good enough to tie for sixth all-time in NFL history for passing touchdowns in a single season. Looking at interceptions, this was Geno Smith, despite not even playing a couple games. He ended up in first with 17. Tua Tagovailoa, who hasn't played the last few games, was second with 15. Probably the reason they're not up there. Sam Darnold for the Seahawks was third with 14. That's kind of interesting. And in fact, you've got Sam Darnold with 14, Justin Herbert with 13, he's fourth, and Trevor Lawrence with 12, he's fifth. All these players are in the playoffs. So is Bo Nix, who's tied for seventh with 11. So they're all in the playoffs, and yet they're in the top of the top 10 in interceptions. Now, I will say for Trevor Lawrence, most of those interceptions came in the first half of the season. The last half of the season, he had like one. In the last 6 or 7 games, he's had one interception, maybe 2. So primarily, most of them came early on until the light switched on for him. And his season has changed this last 7 weeks. When they've been on this winning streak of 8 games, I believe it is, Trevor Lawrence has played so much differently. All right. I don't know what's going to happen to Tagovailoa. I mean, they benched him, and I really, honestly, I've heard him talk about teams he could go to. I don't know that I'd want to have him on my team as my quarterback. I just don't think so. Now, Cam Ward, when it comes to quarterback sacks, and Geno Smith again tied for the lead with 55. It's kind of deceiving in a way. Justin Herbert was third with 54. They're the only 3 players over 50, in fact. But Cam Ward, I mean, he was up to in the 40s 2/3 of the way through the season. And yet in the last half of the season, or the last third of the season, his numbers dropped way off. He was getting sacked instead of 4 to 7, 8 times a game. He was getting sacked once or twice a game, and some games none. They really figured something out with Tennessee with Cam Ward that slowed this pace down, because he was on a record pace early on, and he just continued to improve. I guess he figured out the offense, throwing the ball more on time than before, but his numbers really dropped. On the other hand, somebody like Justin Herbert started off a little slow, and he picked up pace. He probably would have been the leader in sacks if it hadn't been for the fact that he didn't even play the last game of the season. Now, Cam Ward also was out after the first quarter in that game, so that made a difference as well. Drake May was fourth in sacks 47 times, which is fourth best or worst. Again, looking at some of these quarterbacks, Justin Herbert, 54, Drake May, 47, Trevor Lawrence, 41, Josh Allen, 40, Jared Goff, 38. All these quarterbacks are in the playoffs. So what's that? 5 of the top 10 are in the playoffs, and yet they also led in sacks. All right. In moving over to the running backs, rushing yards, James Cook ended up as the leader, the season leader in rushing with 1,621 yards. Incredibly, Derrick Henry came on strong, almost caught James Cook. In fact, I thought he was, because he had 100 yards at halftime. He needed about 150. He ended up in the 126 area, but he came in second. Derrick Henry was second in rushing with 1,595 yards. So that's 26 yards behind James Cook. And then Jonathan Taylor, who did not have a good game, was third with 1,585. Those top three, they were the top three, and by over 100 yards over fourth place, Bijan Robinson. Really incredible seasons. Jonathan Taylor and James Cook, for the longest time, and were averaging 100 yards a game. And James Cook was all the way up until last week. Now, he only went in and, for whatever reason, ran the ball twice, but really wasn't participating in the game. Only had a few yards, so he didn't get 100 yards either. So no player had 100 yards rushing per game for the season. Those are your top three. And I'm very impressed with Derrick Henry, these seasons he put back to back. Now, last year, Saquon Barkley had 2,000 yards. This year, he came in 10th in rushing yards in a single season with 1,140. That's a drop-off of almost 900 yards. Derrick Henry had 1,900 yards last year, and he had almost 1,600, so that's about a drop of 300 yards. Not as big a drop. Very impressive comeback year after such a big year in 2024. I really was impressed with the second half of Derrick Henry's season. Unfortunately for them, they didn't make it to the playoffs, which cost their coach his job. So I'll be fascinated to see who they get as a new coach, and maybe they change their offensive style a little bit. I really didn't like it. I mean, yeah, you got Jackson and Henry, but the way they pass the ball, or lack of passing, is, I think, something that they could really help improve their game. All right, that's rushing yards. Let's look at rushing touchdowns. Now, Jonathan Taylor held on to this lead. He ended up with 18 rushing touchdowns this season. Derrick Henry back up there again. He had 16 last year, another 16 this year. 16 was good enough to tie for the lead last year with Cook and I think it was Gibbs. And both of those players did pretty well this year as well. Gibbs had 13 touchdowns. Cook had 12. Now on this list, you have Josh Allen with 14. He was third. And you have James Cook with 12. So you got two Bills on this list. You know, that's a total of 26 rushing touchdowns by those two players alone. Something that definitely is going to be could be a factor in the playoffs. Now, Derrick Henry, he's just been moving up the list all time in the NFL in career touchdowns. We'll talk about that another time. But as far as the season goes, Jonathan Taylor with 18 rushing touchdowns, That's good enough to tie him for 6th all-time in NFL history for most rushing touchdowns in a season with 18. So though his season was disappointing in the last third of the season, he did have a really good season. And honestly, part of, a couple reasons. One, the Colts' schedule really got more difficult in the last third of their season. Plus, Daniel Jones went out. That hurt them, bringing in Phillip Rivers and having the backup quarterback, that rookie. I mean, they gave it their all, but it's not good enough. And just put a lot of pressure on Jonathan Taylor, and defenses focused more on him, made it more difficult. And like I said, the last third of their season was difficult, more difficult than it had been in the early season. They played the Jaguars twice. The Jaguars were, for the season, the number one defense against the rush. So there's one of the reasons. Jonathan Taylor never had more than 70 yards against the Jaguars, and that was even one of the better games that he had, in fact. All right, let's look at rushing yards by quarterback. Now, this is Josh Allen. Josh Allen had 579 yards rushing. Justin Herbert was second with 498, and Jackson Dart was third with 487. And I've said this many times, I have no doubt that Jackson Dart, if he'd have played the entire season, or most of it, in fact, if they hadn't put Wilson in and just put Dart in right away, this would have been a record that Jackson Dart would have had. He ended up third with 487. Drake May was fourth with 450. Now, on this list, you got Josh Allen, like I said, Justin Herbert, Drake May, Jalen Hurts, Caleb Williams, and Trevor Lawrence, all in the top 10, and they're all in the playoffs. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 6 of the top 10 quarterbacks in rushing yards are in the playoffs. I think that's significant. And Baker Mayfield's on this list, and his team just missed out because of the fact that the Atlanta Falcons won their last 2 games of the year. And, all right, let's move over to receptions. This was very close among 3 players, but Puka Nacua ends up on the top with 129 receptions this season to lead the NFL in that category. Trey McBride for the Cardinals was second with 126. They both had 119 going into week 18, but Puka Nacua put up 10 catches. Trey McBride had 7. Puka Nacua ends up as the leader. Jamar Chase was third with 125. Now, he could have won if he'd have played another game, but so Puka Nacua missed a game as well, and he still had 129. Jackson Smith-Njigba was third with 119. There were 7 players, which is not as many as last year, I don't think. 7 players that had 100 or more receptions this year. Really, that seems a lower number, even though the high yardage of a couple of them was higher than people last year. Now in receptions, with 129 by Puka Nacua, that's good enough to tie for 7th all-time in NFL history for most receptions in a single season. So good for him. Really an excellent season between him and Stafford. And this is always the way it works. If a quarterback's throwing a bunch of touchdowns or a bunch of yards, as Stafford did, he had over 4,700 yards. Of course, Puka Nacua is going to get a lot of those catches. And he makes some incredible catches too. Now, looking at receiving yards, Jackson Smith-Njigba was able to hold off Puka Nacua, who kept gaining on him. But Smith-Njigba had such a big lead early on, Puka Nacua never really was able to catch him. But both of them averaged over 100 yards receiving in a game. Jackson Smith-Njigba had 1,793 receiving yards to Puka Nacua's 1,715. They were both incredible. George Pickens was third with 1,429, so almost 300 yards behind Puka Nacua and almost 60 364 yards behind Jackson Smith-Njigba. That's a couple of games, 3 games, in fact, at pace-wise behind those two players. So kudos to Smith-Njigba and Nacua. Both really excellent receivers. Very kind of different to me. Nacua is not as fast. Really great route running. They're both great receivers. Smith-Njigba is a little faster and really can make some quite the moves. Puka Nacua is just a big guy too, man. He'll knock you over. Just a little bit different, but both very effective. Now, Smith-Njigba with that 1,793 yards, that's good enough to to be 8th all-time in the NFL and for a season in receiving yards. So kudos to him. Really a great season, and now they move on to the playoffs. So we'll see how he does in the playoffs. He could be a big key for the Seattle when they go into the playoffs. Let's take a look at receiving touchdowns for a season. Now, Davante Adams won this category with 14 receiving touchdowns. He had 14, though, after 14 weeks, and then he didn't play again, which is unfortunate. He really had a chance to make it in the NFL all-time receiving touchdowns for a single season. He was close, but the fact that he didn't play really hurt him. But he still ended up winning this category by quite a ways over Amon-Ra St. Brown for the Lions, Trey McBride for the Cardinals, and Dallas Goedert for the Eagles. All had 11. Those are tied for second. And as I said, Davante Adams had 14. Now, just to continue to show you how close Smith-Njigba and Nacua were, as I said, they were less than about 70 yards or so difference in receiving yards. And touchdowns, they tied. They both had the same amount of receiving touchdowns at 10. So, which was good enough to tie for 5th. Moving on to receptions by running backs. Christian McCaffrey was able to get to 100 receptions, which, by the way, was one of only 7 players to have 100 receptions this season. He's the only running back, obviously, to do it. He finished 6th in receptions in the NFL, and he finishes 1st as far as receptions by running backs with 102. Bijan Robinson was 2nd with 79. And then Jahmyr Gibbs for the Lions had 77. Kenneth Gainwell ended up with 73. He didn't even make it onto the top 10 for a while, and then he just kept going up and up this list, and then ended up in 4th for the Steelers. Now, that number of 102 receptions was good enough to tie Christian McCaffrey for 4th all-time in NFL history for receptions by running backs in a single season. So, excellent season for him. He's some people's candidate for MVP, but he won't win it. He might get some votes, finish in 4th or 5th or something like that. Now, receiving yards by running backs. This is Christian McCaffrey with 924 yards. I know that they were pushing, but they just couldn't get it done. The teams were too tough and too much focus on him, but he ended up with 924 yards receiving. He wanted to get to 1,000, and so did he have at least 1,000 yards rushing and receiving. Didn't quite make that. Still, obviously, a really good season. He had 924 yards. Bijan Robinson was 2nd with 820, so a little over 100 yards behind. But then there's a big drop down to Jahmyr Gibbs, who was 3rd with 613. That's another 200-yard drop from Gibbs to Robinson and 300 yards from Gibbs to McCaffrey. It's huge. And the same thing happens when you go from Gibbs to Achane. Devon Achane for the Dolphins was 4th with 488. That's over 125 yards behind Gibbs. It's just a huge drop. Those 4 players drop, big drop, big drop, big drop. And then after Achane, it's very close all the way from 4th to 10th. In fact, Kenneth Gainwell was 5th with 486, only 2 yards behind Devon. Pretty impressive seasons, actually, by McCaffrey, Robinson, and Gibbs, to be honest. All three of them really had some excellent seasons as far as receivers go. And they're such valuable weapons. I mean, I really love to watch the way Robinson runs. I think next year he could lead in all these categories. I do like him even over Gibbs. And of course, I like Christian McCaffrey, but he's starting to get up there a little. He's older than these two guys. So we'll see how he does next year as he puts another year under his belt. Now, looking at yards from scrimmage, John Robinson was the man here. He ended up with 2,298 yards from scrimmage. Second was Christian McCaffrey with 2,126, so 172 yards more for Bijan Robinson over Christian McCaffrey. They're the only two players over 2,000 yards. Jonathan Taylor was third with 1,963. So those two players, Robinson and McCaffrey, really had impressive seasons. Now, Jonathan Taylor was up there for a while, but as I said, that last third of the year, his season just really dropped off. Looking down the list at number 7, Jackson Smith-Njigba with 1,829 yards. Now, obviously, all but 36 of those yards came from receiving. He did have 36 yards rushing. And again, I'm mentioning him. He was in 7th. Puka Nacua was in 8th with 1,820 yards. Only 9 yards separated Smith-Njigba and Nacua. Nacua had 105 yards rushing, which helped him gain a little bit more ground on Smith-Njigba. So they were so close in every category, whether it was yards, receptions, or yards from scrimmage. That's how good those two were and how comparable they were as far as numbers go this season. Another interesting number here, Puka Nacua, as I mentioned, was 8th with 1,820 yards. Kyron Williams was 10th for the Rams with 1,533. So you have two Rams in the top 10 for yards from scrimmage. So between the two of them, they combine for over 3,300 yards for the Rams. That's incredible. Kyron Williams had 281 yards receiving for his side and then 1,252 yards rushing to get to his number of 1,533. That's the only team. I mean, obviously, you don't normally see two players from the same team have that many yards from scrimmage. All right, let's move on to next category. This is longest field goals, and I talked about this at the beginning, but Cam Little set the NFL record with a 68-yard field goal, and that was indoors in New Orleans. And then last week, he had a 67-yard field goal, which is the second longest field goal in NFL history. He did that in Jacksonville, outdoors. Those are the top two. Chase McLaughlin was third he had a 65-yard field goal this year. Those were the top three. Brandon Aubrey had the fourth longest, which was 64, but he was also on this list 3 times. So Cam Little was on it twice. Aubrey was on this list 3 times. He had a 61-yarder, 63, and a 64. He's also kicked a 65-yard. I think that was last year. So he obviously, given the situations, it's worked out for Cam Little. Both of these field goals that he got were at the end of the first half and with really no option if he missed it for the other team. He made them, which was great, but you have to have a certain situation. He's not going to kick a 67-yard field goal if the game's really tight, and if he misses it, it gives the other team really good field advantage to come down and win, say, by a field goal. They probably don't kick that 67-yarder. So sometimes this is situational, because I do think somebody like Aubrey could kick a 68-yarder if he had the opportunity. Now, he did have a long kick, something like that, in the high 60s, and he missed it, though, at some point in this season. So you also got to make it. but 11 times somebody had a 60-yarder or longer this season. All right, moving to defense. Myles Garrett in tackles for loss led the NFL with 33. 33 tackles for loss. Max Crosby was second with 28, and he didn't even play the last game. He had 28. Then Brian Burns drops way down to him with 22. He was third with 22. Those are your top 3 players. Now, the Texans had Will Anderson in 5th, tied for 4th actually, with 20, and Daniel Hunter, who was tied for 8th with 15. So they had 2 players in the top 10 in tackles for loss. So between them, that's 35, which is very impressive as well. Now, looking at Max Crosby and Myles Garrett, their numbers were so good, in fact, that Myles Garrett with 33 tackles for loss was good enough for second all-time in NFL histories for tackles for loss in a season. And Max Crosby with 28 was good enough to tie for 5th all-time in NFL history for tackles for loss in a season. How impressive is that? Max Crosby could have he only needed one more to tie for second. So it's unfortunate he couldn't play that last game. But those 2 players were incredible this year. And to have 2 players make it to the top 10 all-time in NFL history in the same season is impressive for those 2 players. You know, Raiders did a good job of paying Max Crosby what he needed to be paid, because he is the star of their team on defense for sure. We'll see what happens to that team, because they fired their coach as well. Hopefully they get somebody in there that can present an offense that's not from 1962 and have just a better team all the way around. All right, last category, and obviously a huge one, and that's sacks. And everybody knows Myles Garrett set the NFL record for sacks. And obviously that was also going to be the number 1 leader in sacks for this season, with 23 sacks for Myles Garrett of the Cleveland Browns. Brian Burns was second with 16.5, so quite a bit of distance between Myles Garrett and Brian Burns. Daniel Hunter for the Texans was third with 15. Those were your top 3 players. Myles Garrett for the Browns with 23, and as I said, that number is good enough to be the number 1 sack artist in the NFL history for a single season. One other fact here with these sacks is, again, the Texans. This time, Daniel Hunter is at the top of this list. He had 15 sacks. Will Anderson Jr. had 12, so they combined for 27 sacks this year. That is a good defense, and they're going to be tough. Broncos, who led the NFL in sacks as a team, Nick Bonito was 5th with 14. He's the only one on this list. So they just spread the wealth around as far as sacks goes. That's kind of interesting. You don't have one person. You have Nick Bonito with 14, but then you must have a lot of players who have a decent amount of sacks to lead the NFL in sacks. Another team, the Atlanta Falcons, they set their own record. They had 55 plus sacks this year, which is a huge number. They don't have anybody in the top 10. So again, another team where they spread the wealth around as far as sacks goes. All right, that's a look at our season leaders. Really some impressive seasons this year in certain categories. And Myles Garrett tops it off, by setting an NFL record. It was really great to see him do it in that game. And and you could just see the relief wash off him as he made that sack. I mean, there was only 5 minutes to go in the game when it happened, and they were doing everything they could to get him that sack. I mean, Cleveland Browns were doing everything they could, moving him around, trying their best. And he made a quick move around the defender and kind of just grabbed the court Burrow, and Burrow went down. All right, that's a wrap. So please like and subscribe. You can find this podcast on Just the Stats NFL on YouTube. You can watch it there, see the charts that I put up, and you'll see all the top 10 players in every category that I mentioned. And you can also listen there and listen to any podcast app you use, Spotify, Apple, whatever you happen to use. All right. So until tomorrow, that is a wrap for NFL Top 10s for Thursday. I'm out.